And now I give the floor to Mr. Edward Joseph to address the conference as well.
Thank you very much, Ognen. Let me begin here with these words. In paradox lies clarity. Thank you very much. That's my profound message for the conference. I wish you a good event. Ognen said to keep it short. But no, I want to say to everyone here, and as well the honored Defense Minister Petrovska, and of course the rector and director of the University American College Skopje, that how honored I am to be with you all here today. And the reason I opened with that line is because actually that is the theme of my speech to you here this morning. And in a moment I'm going to set out what is that paradox. I'm going to give you the explanation for that paradox. And if you stay with me, I'm going to give 4 specific recommendations for your country, your beautiful country, North Macedonia, in its search for security in this context. So what is the paradox that I'm speaking about? It's the one that I observed back in the spring when Foreign Minister Bujar Osmani had the Press Forum Dialogue opening, preparatory event. And I mentioned it then, and it remains this very troubling paradox. And the paradox is this. On February 24th, the world changed, but the Balkans didn't change. And if you look around the region, in 5 of the Western Balkan 6 countries, that is all except Albania, are in arguably worse shape, with worse ethno-national divisions and worse relations either internally or in their relations with neighbors, 5 out of the 6. And if you think about it, the premise for this paradox, it's even worse, because the West already held the strategic advantage in the Balkans over Russia and China prior to February 24th. In geography, if we look at the region, it's the opposite of Ukraine and the opposite of Republic of Georgia. Russia is far, NATO is present. The inherent strategic advantage is here. The countries in the region are either members of NATO or surrounded by NATO. And all but 3 are members themselves of NATO. And one of them that isn't, Kosovo, is protected by a NATO peacekeeping force and avidly wants to join NATO. And now, if we look at the conflict, the momentum of the conflict, of the war in Ukraine, due to the unprovoked Russian invasion, has shifted. And we have eminent American generals like General Petraeus stating essentially that a Russian defeat is virtually inevitable. And what we heard yesterday from Vladimir Putin suggests desperation on the part of the Russians. Acknowledgement, finally, by Putin that really this is not any special military operation. It's a war that's going very badly, and now calling for a partial mobilization. And this included, outrageously, a veiled threat to use nuclear weapons and setting up illegitimate referenda in Donetsk and Luhansk, setting this up, which would provide the supposed pretext and a recharacterization of the war as a defense of the Russian motherland. So this is all part of a very dangerous scheme by Putin. And this is the same menace that's already existing, unfolding on the ground in the country. Not just the threat of tactical nuclear weapons, but the active, reckless attacks at times and management of nuclear power plants in the country, including Europe's largest nuclear power plant and including the Chernobyl plant responsible for the globe's worst nuclear disaster, one that I should remind you, the radiation from back in 1986 affected former Yugoslavia, and potentially health risks that have continued to the present day. And there are other associated costs, all well known to you and the defense minister. the death toll in Ukraine, the remarkable death toll for the Russians themselves, which is estimated to be at least 20,000, with casualties as high as 60,000 there. And an energy crisis, a global food crisis, all caused by this event. In sum, here's the point, why this paradox is so striking. The situation in Ukraine has never been more black and white. And yet in the Balkans, it's not black and white. Let me give you the results of a recent poll in Montenegro, so we won't keep just the focus on North Macedonia. A plurality in Montenegro does blame Russia and Putin. 34.4% blames Putin for the war. But 30%, just 4% difference, blame either the US, NATO, or Ukraine, Zelensky. So you have 30% pointing the finger in the other direction, plus another 20% say all are guilty. In other words, you have a majority of Montenegrins who do not agree with the broad Western perception of this war. Putin gets very high marks. And in Montenegro, we should be aware that there's a NATO member, there's a pro-Russian party, controlled or heavily influenced from Belgrade, DF, that potentially could join a new government. So and contrast this in another aspect. There's another aspect that makes this paradox so striking, is the contrast with the power growth, what I would describe as the power growth on the Western side. We have unprecedented, truly unprecedented transatlantic unity, even going back to the Cold War. There were differences in the Cold War. Those are almost vanished today. Only some small differences, really, across the Atlantic about this conflict. NATO is revived, including wholly unforeseen Swedish and Finnish membership. These were proud countries that were proud of their neutrality, have joined NATO. The famous German Zeitenwende, where Germany now providing lethal military weapons, crossing this taboo, a sense of sacrifice, revival of the West, revival of liberal democracy, and again, I underscore this sense of sacrifice. I just spoke to a German journalist who believes, yes, Germans will hang together despite the increased energy costs that they will face. He believes that they will hang together. We've seen the power of the West to use sweeping sanctions on Russia. And we've seen also, I think, under President Biden, acknowledgement that the threat, the proof, first of all, of his binary between democracy and autocracy, and his open acknowledgement that democracies like the United States, even our own, face threats from within. So it's not just some broad illusion, it's an open acknowledgement of that. At the same time, while the Western power has increased and cohesiveness has increased and the value of the model has increased, Russia and China, we see open dissension. The recent meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, open dissension, fairly thinly veiled criticism of Russia from China and from India, in actually fairly clear terms, that clearly China putting limits on what had been stated in February just prior to the invasion was a no limits in relationship. So, in summary, we should consider why is there this paradox in the Balkans? What we should have seen, think about it, what we should have seen in the wake of February 24th was sweeping change in the region. The region should have aligned very quickly, and the US and EU, with this newfound resurgence and recognition of the threat and the continuing threat from Russia in this region and the continuing instability and fragility of this region, we should have seen swift action to overcome these legacy ethno-national divisions and have really rapid movement towards progress and even conclusion of some of the outstanding issues. And these are issues that have long been known and processes that have long been around. So this, in my view, demands an explanation. Now, I don't pretend to have all the answers here, and hopefully maybe in some of the discussions today, some of you will tackle this paradox. But let me offer a couple. here. Let me divide it into two halves, if I could. The first is, of course, the broad disappointment that the region has felt, and rightfully so, for this protracted approach towards the European Union. The sheer amount of time, 20 years, over 2 decades since the last fighting in former Yugoslavia, and still there's this distant prospect of joining the European Union, and only one conflict-affected country from the region, Croatia, has joined the European Union, and that was back in 2013. So we can understand that. And the other aspect of this that we can understand is that it's disconnected from the performance in many respects, not completely, but in many respects, disconnected from the performance of the countries themselves. And of course, we have no better example of that than your country, Madam Minister, North Macedonia. No country has made more sacrifices to make peace and to tackle these issues in a serious and honest way than North Macedonia. No country is more deserving of that pathway to the European Union. And I agree with you completely, Madam Minister, that the membership in NATO is absolutely critical, and we can imagine how the security, how it would be adversely affected for North Macedonia if you were not. The intensity of Russian action and attention to your country if you were not a member of NATO. We could imagine that. Now again, your country, no country has made more sacrifice, but I want to emphasize these have been good sacrifices. Let's go back to the Ohrid Agreement. The Ohrid Agreement, I know still some people don't like the Ohrid Agreement. This is a solid agreement that should have been the model for the region. It is inherently superior compared to the Dayton Agreement, which is an ethno-territorial model. The Ohrid Agreement, no territory, it's an agreement over rights, and for ethnic Albanians to exercise and enjoy those rights, they have to participate in the central government. Exactly the opposite is the case under the Dayton Agreement in Bosnia-Herzegovina. For Serbs to protect their rights, they undermine the central government, preserving the ethno-territorial citadel of Republika Srpska and undermining the state, and the Ohrid Agreement is not that way. It's the opposite. The second, I agree completely, Madam Minister, the Prespa Agreement. This was a sound agreement. This was a true compromise between Greece and North Macedonia. Greece also gave concessions. It wasn't a one-way agreement at all. Greece made very important concessions acknowledging the Macedonian identity, the Macedonian language, the Macedonian people. This is a significant agreement. Now, let me quickly say a word about the Friendship Agreement. In the spirit of that name, the agreement didn't need to be problematic. In the spirit of friendship, to say common history didn't need to be problematic. But of course, we know it is problematic, and we have to be frank about that, because when one party interprets common history to mean Bulgarian history, it's a problem. And when that country has leverage, it's a problem. So I understand that. But at the time and in the context of friendship, it didn't need to be that. Many countries speak of common history, but in this context, it did prove to be problematic. And again, after taking these steps, particularly the Prespa Agreement, we saw, what did the European Union do? We saw France in 2019, France, not Bulgaria, France block the opening for North Macedonia after this historic compromise, again, a fair compromise on Prespa. It was France opening the door later for Bulgaria. And now we have the irony of the previous French EU presidency trying to stitch this back up in a way that we all know, we have to be candid about this, was highly deferential to Bulgarian interest. And we saw, in a way, of Bulgaria completely against the spirit and even the rules of the European Union, dictating, and even contrary to the logic of the European Union, of allowing such issues, creating a precedent for such issues to enter the European Union. And guess who that could affect down the road? Guess who that could affect down the road? Ukraine. because Ukraine is not free from claims by neighboring states, among them, and most notably, Hungary. So Hungary can use this as a precedent. So very problematic for another reasons. But not only North Macedonia hasn't been met with its important and valid commitments and sacrifices. Kosovo, repeatedly, it's been affirmed by European Commission, has met the standards, fulfilled the obligations for visa liberalization, and it's been denied. And it's been denied that. So we know part of this legacy, to answer part of this paradox, of course, we have to look at this record and understand this record of disappointment. But that should not distract us from the responsibility of leaders in the region themselves. So let's not forget that. And let's be fair and acknowledge that across the region, in many respects, not in all cases, but there is a self-interested and self-dealing political class in many of these countries. I say not all countries and not all respects. And this contributes to an atmosphere in which there's an appeal for the authoritarian solution, a continuing appeal. At least they get stuff done. And that brings me to the wider question here, because we know the answer to the self-dealing, and we know the answer to the weak rule of law and reform and corruption. We know the answer. The answer is to the reform process towards joining the European Union. But that's blocked in some cases by outsiders, but in most cases by these persistent ethno-national divisions and questions. Again, that should have been rapidly addressed years ago, but certainly in the wake of the Russian invasion. So why? Why is it so hard? Why is it so hard for a region that is oriented? This isn't the Middle East. This is a region that's strategically oriented towards Europe and has a pathway that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world to join NATO and the European Union, the two premier Western organizations. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, such an opportunity. So why is it so difficult, so protracted, this process? Let me give you my explanation. Strategic confusion on the part of the United States and the European Union towards the region in two respects. Strategic confusion. First, the US and the EU together tend to undervalue the region, undervalue the consequences of instability in the Balkans, and see it as peripheral and a problem to be managed rather than issues that need to be resolved. The second is we tend to overcomplicate the problem. We see the region, especially today, as this morass, Balkans morass of problems. Look at Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croats and Bosniaks and Montenegrins and Serbs and Kosovo and Serbia. And, oh my gosh, it's a morass. And it's actually not a morass. As I and colleagues wrote it in a report that we put out in January, it's actually not a morass. The problem generally is, if we can look at it in two parts, is the problem of former Yugoslavia. When Yugoslavia divided, what was the overarching question? What would happen to the Serbs who live outside of Yugoslavia? That's the question for instability in four countries. First was Croatia, but you have Bosnia still today, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Kosovo. And you have in this situation, unfortunately, instead of Serbia moving in a democratic path and moving towards the European Union and towards NATO, you have Serbia moving in the opposite direction under Alexander Vučić. And I'm going to come to North Macedonia's relationship with Serbia in a moment. I'm going to come to that. But that's this strategic confusion that the United States and European Union have, both undervaluing and overcomplicating the issues. Now, of course, North Macedonia, your threats come from Bulgaria at present. That's your primary, and I understand that, and I'm going to come and explain to that. But we have to understand this. It's not that there's Western Balkans 6. That's in a way very misleading. Serbia is the largest country in the Western Balkans 6 with the largest economy. And it's the nature of Serbian nationalism is particularly problematic. It's focalized within Belgrade, projecting throughout the region, and you have a revisionist leader, a leader who wants to undo the settlements there in Alexander Vučić. Now, And the problem here, the US and the EU do not understand how to apply the power that we have, particularly this newfound power and leverage that we have and ought to be able to apply in this. So this is all the good news here, is that this is all less complicated than it sounds. As we wrote in our report, Serbian leverage really boils down to the Kosovo question and treating the fact that Kosovo has been treated as a different case from the rest of former Yugoslavia, from Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, North Macedonia, Montenegro. It's been treated differently. And as I could explain, I won't take the time today, there's no real basis for that. Serbia had a challenge in 2010, just as North Macedonia took its case to the International Court of Justice against Greece for not respecting the interim accord and blocking then Macedonia from joining international organizations, and prevailed at the International Court of Justice. Serbia also had its turn in court. So I'm not being unfair to Serbia here. I understand that. I understand the connection to Kosovo. Don't think I don't. But Serbia had its chance. It took the case through the UN General Assembly, where we just saw President Biden and others speak yesterday, through its leadership in the UNGA, referred the question to the court in The Hague under then Foreign Minister Jeremic, and drafted the question. Belgrade drafted the question. And the question was answered by the court. The Declaration of Independence by Kosovo is not against international law and not against Resolution 1244 that Russia and Putin and Serbia and Vucic constantly cite to. So Serbia had its chance in court, it just doesn't like the answer that it got. And I can explain, if anyone here wants to know about the fine details of that case, I'm happy to explain that. Now, again, there's a solution here. No group in the region understands this better than Macedonians. Why? Because the way Serbia exercises its leverage is virtually the same as the way Bulgaria exercises its leverage over your country. Essentially, Bulgaria, of course, has its leverage by being an EU member, and they operate by consensus. And guess what? Serbia is effectively a member of the European Union when it comes to Kosovo. I'll bet you didn't know that, but it is. It's effectively Bulgaria when it comes to Kosovo. And that explains everything. It explains all of those issues in all of those countries, in Bosnia, in Montenegro, in Kosovo. How? How does it have this leverage? How is it like Bulgaria? Very simple. 5 EU countries, 4 of which are members of NATO, don't recognize Kosovo. And what is their position? They say, we won't recognize Kosovo until Serbia does. So they've handed their proxy to Belgrade. They've made Belgrade into Sofia. That's the issue. Now, the rest, there's a dialogue and a pretense and so forth, and association of Serbian municipalities. I can address all of those questions. But that is the fundamental point. This is not some kind of, there's a dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo. There is not. There's a dialogue in which one country enjoys structural leverage. The same way, there's not a dialogue between Bulgaria and North Macedonia. Bulgaria enjoys structural leverage in that. And that's the essence. I'm clear, the problems in the Historic Commission and so forth. So let me come here to also to your position. Your position, what can North Macedonia do? As I said, Serbia is the largest country. Bulgaria is a much larger country. What about your position? What can a small country that has threats, what can it do? Here, first is recognize the reality. That's the first thing. Recognize the reality. Serbia today is an autocracy. And we see playing out in Ukraine the consequences of this. Joe Biden was right when he said, before the invasion, when he said this is the overarching challenge is between autocracy and democracy. He was right. The Germans now know that. You don't do deals with autocrats. If you asked Angela Merkel, she would privately tell you that. It's a mistake. And it's the same in your region, in a different context. I'm not saying the parallel is exact, but you need to understand the character of the Serbia you're dealing with. It's not the character under Boris Tadic or his predecessors, including nationalists like Koštunica. It's not the same. It's an autocracy, and autocracies are instability. And let me quickly, lest you think I'm some kind of, oh, who is this American, this anti-Serb? No, let me quickly read, if I could. This is the interim speaker of the Serbian parliament. I repeat, this was a Koštunica guy, Vladeta Jankovic. He was a Koštunica guy. And here's what he said. Let me just quickly read. This was in August, opening the Serbian parliament. He, as the oldest member, was the honorary interim leader. Serbia, deprived of fair elections, cannot be a happy and respected country. There will not and cannot be fair elections as long as every citizen of Serbia, even the most remote, cannot see what the government says and does, but also what those who are not in power have to say about it. In Serbian state television broadcasts, there are no fair elections, and there cannot be as long as there is bribery, pressure, and violence. As long as the national media space is not made available to everyone, as long as the election commissions are waiting for the ruling politicians to decide for them, as long as the will and whim of one man, he means Alexander Vučić, are above the Constitution, and especially as long as the courts tacitly approve all this, okay? That's not me, that's not Freedom House, that's not some Western organization, that's Jankovic, the interim speaker, Serbian parliament, again, coming from a nationalist tradition and calling out this. And we know Serbia carries on and promotes the Russian agenda, refusing to put sanctions on. So, and this is not just without consequence, because by not putting on sanctions, that means continuing to host Sputnik Serbia and other Russian outlets here. So what can North Macedonia do? What can you do in this scenario? Again, recognize the reality. Second is, of course, it's understandable. Your threat comes from Bulgaria. It's natural, even goes back in time, to seek protection in a Serbian / what we would call the previous Yugoslav orbit. It's understandable. I understand that. I get that. Serbia is the main threat. But just understand where Serbian nationalism leads. Inevitably, greater Serbia begets greater Albania. Okay? And greater Albania is absolutely destructive of your country. Now, I want to be very clear. There's media here and so forth. I want to be clear. I don't say there's an active movement, and certainly not in your country, for greater Albania. But what I say is that greater Serbia, this Serb world, revived Serb world, this notion, and this constant tension and instability, when you have an autocratic leader, that's what it leads to inevitably. I'm not talking about secret deals between Tirana and Belgrade, but I am talking about very problematic stances from Edi Rama and Alexander Vučić. And if you noticed what Edi Rama just said at the meeting of Open Balkan in Belgrade, just said there, astonishing remark, saying that the US and EU should stop pressuring Serbia over sanctions on Russia. This is astonishing. From a NATO member. Albania is a NATO member. Who is Albania? Who is Edi Rama to say that Serbia should get a free pass on these? It's astonishing. It should be a wake-up call about where this goes. So again, my suggestion, this is it. I understand the threat from Bulgaria. What I recommend is balance this Open Balkan, which I've written about. It has its own very problematic character. It's essentially, again, you're talking about a political arrangement of gifting the country with the largest and strongest economy, the political leadership. There's serious, significant political implications for that for your country. I understand all of that. You should balance that. North Macedonia should balance this unhealthy triangle of Tirana, Belgrade, backed with good relationships with Ankara, with Turkey, with Erdogan. You should balance that unhealthy triangle with a healthy triangle. What is the healthy triangle? I'll tell you what it is. Skopje, Pristina, Athens. That's the healthy triangle. Each of those countries has the same interest to preserve stability in the region around multi-ethnic democracies. The relationship, your country, North Macedonia's relationship with Kosovo is of strategic importance. Mutual respect for multi-ethnic democracy within existing borders, no changes to borders, no unions with Albania, no partitions, no land swaps, the last thing. And guess who shares this interest? Greece, your former nemesis, the country that at one time put an embargo on your country, devastating your economy and kept you out of NATO for all of those decades. The Prespa agreement, I so agree with the Minister, transformative, positive agreement, strategically positive for your country. Athens shares, Greece shares that strategic interest to have stability in the region, to achieve the Western vision, keeping these countries within their existing borders, no graders, no unions. And that is that's the healthy triangle. And let me close here, just some other specifics that I would recommend for you. Specific recommendations. Okay, I understand this very problematic and tendentious French proposal and what it means. And believe me, I understand. Let me say first, as an outsider, it's not for any outsider to give an opinion on. It's not for any outsider, American embassy, any embassies, European Union, myself, to say what does and does not threaten the Macedonian identity. Only Macedonians, and I would say more broadly citizens of this country, can decide that. It's not for outsiders to say. Identity is subjective. It's inherently subjective. There are perhaps some objective markers and all. Ognen, who's expert here, member of the Historic Commission, can speak to those much more. But it's a subjective thing, and it's not for those who are not part of that group. It's not for me to say it does or does not threaten the Macedonian identity. That's for you to say. But I can say this. As problematic as it is, the French proposal, the screening process, the opening of the screening process is a very important opportunity. Make the most of that opportunity. Use this time, especially knowing how difficult and controversial it will be to change the Constitution. For Bulgaria demands. Use this time to maximize the benefit of that screening process. Make the reforms. Show the citizens that you're not a detached political class. Work on rule of law, on the corruption issue. That's first. That's what I say. Maximize the benefit of that. Second, because this is so problematic, and because the U.S. and EU effectively failed in their job, they failed in their job to do as Greece did and have a fair-minded negotiation. Remember, Greece still was a member of NATO during the Prespa agreement. Greece still had structural leverage, and yet that was a fair negotiation. The U.S. and EU failed to bring Bulgaria and North Macedonia into a fair context, and this French proposal, we know, was done in a platform that was imbalanced, unfair and imbalanced structures. Okay? The EU, and that means EU capitals, especially Paris, and as well Berlin, and obviously Brussels, and Washington, look to them to affirm the Macedonian identity. And they can do this. I proposed this in my article in Foreign Policy back in June. There's very straightforward. This can be done without some great controversy with Bulgaria by taking language from the Prespa agreement. And this can be done. I explain this, how this can be done, and it even can be done in a way that creates disincentives on Bulgaria from making more demands, because the affirmation could become more and more precise over time. And if Bulgaria makes continued demands, the affirmations can become more and more specific to even name historical figures and events. And I will remind you that President Biden, because I will tell you I had a hand in this, congratulated Macedonian Americans on the Ilinden holiday when he was a presidential candidate back in 2020. So that he's on the record on this. And then finally, last, and could easily be overlooked, but it should not be. and I would say this, Madam Defense Minister, because you yourself and your Prime Minister, your President, you will all have a wonderful opportunity to demonstrate Macedonian leadership on the world stage as you become the chairperson in office of OSCE. This is a great fortuity that this happens at this time. Why? Because, of course, you're facing these challenges that you have, and also because OSCE itself is now a frontline organization in this clash between the organization. Those of you who are not familiar, it was emerged in the Cold War. It's essentially a way of bringing Russia and American interests with European one, from Vladivostok to Vancouver, as they say. Canada is a member as well of OSCE. And OSCE has played a significant role within Ukraine, with a mission in Ukraine. And it has a continuing role and mission. So your presidency, your chairpersonship of OSCE is a terrific opportunity to demonstrate leadership and also to advance democratic values and to show your commitment to democratic values, to human rights, even also the rights of extending on identity and national minorities. So it's a wonderful opportunity that we could talk about that, and I can just close and tell you, I personally know about the significance of this from my work. I was deputy head of the OSCE mission in Kosovo, and the Ireland had the chairmanship then, and at that time we had a breakthrough between Serbia and Kosovo in which Ireland, of course, was involved and engaged in as its chairpersonship. So I close with that. The paradox of this region is something we should all be concerned with, and your country, looking for its security, a small country with others, outsiders who have claims on it, need to think strategically about your positioning there and take the steps within your power, your own healthy triangle with Pristina. Build the road, complete that road to Pristina. That's a strategic benefit to your country and to Kosovo, and to proceed in that way and take advantage of the opportunities that you have. Thank you very much.